All right. I will say hello and welcome back to another episode of All About Balance. And today's a special one. Actually, today's a special one. There's been a slight misconception about the podcast, and maybe we can talk about that later. But yourself, sir, is sort of the Mount Everest, the peak of Everest that I'm attempting to do on this podcast. So today I am joined by the Mack Brown Distinguished Professor at the University of Texas for history. I am joined by a gentleman that has authored 10 books, which is astounding, countless articles, and is the host of a podcast that at the time of this recording has released 148 episodes, which is also mind-blowing. Professor Jeremi Suri, how's it going?
I am well. Thank you for having me on. I'm excited for this conversation.
Absolutely. The pleasure is absolutely mine. So I guess we'll dive into the question that I wanted to ask, or sort of the topic that I wanted to cover. And I want to start really by taking you back slightly to I say slightly, it's 9 years, to your TED Talk in 2012. Now, for those that haven't watched the TED Talk, could you give a short synopsis of what your aims were in that TED Talk?
Sure. I am a deep believer, Harry, that all of us can benefit from stimulating our brains to ask historical questions. We don't have to be historians, but there's a part of our brain that's mathematical. There's a part of our brain that's historical. And the historical part is how we learn from the past. And I feel like every day, so many smart people do things that are bollocks, do things that have a terrible consequence, because they don't ask the right questions. They're not learning from the past. And learning from the past doesn't mean you repeat the past, and we can talk about that. But it does mean you gain some wisdom from the past and at least learn to ask the right questions that will help you to make better decisions. And so that's why I gave this TED Talk, to explain what that means and how all of us can do that.
So again, if anybody hasn't gone and watched the TED Talk, please, I implore you to go and watch the TED Talk. I will put the link for the TED Talk in the show notes of this episode. One thing that, I've taken many quotes in my note taking. One of them was, you were saying that it's not possible to come up with laws for human behavior. It's not possible to come up with formulas for human behavior. However, what we can do is to understand the patterns of human behavior and the complexity of their interactions between one another. And I think I'm going to use that as the title of our conversation. And the reason why I'm going to use that as the title is something that I'm vastly interested in and have been for a little while is AI, is virtual reality, and is how I feel like less and less we are being what we would define as human maybe 10, 15, 20 years ago, or even 100 years ago. And more we are becoming something that is as yet undefined, as yet not in the dictionary, as yet not accounted for. And my question, based on the quote that you've made, is, if it's not possible to come up with laws of behavior, why are we attempting it?
Well, there's a natural desire we all have to make the world simple, which is one of the reasons that a lot of people look to math as an explanation for behavior. And I'm all for mathematical sophistication, but any sophisticated mathematical thinker will tell you that math is an approximation of reality. And so we want that, we need that, because if the world is too complex, we don't know what to do. We become helpless. So the urge to simplicity is one that's natural and appropriate, but it goes too far. And we end up overriding the complexity that we know is there. And what history reminds us of, and I think what the hardest hurdle for artificial intelligence to teach a robot to do, is to be able to take account of the complexity in human behavior that we know is there, that is unpredictable. And another way of saying it, it's the unpredictable things that we can predict will be unpredictable. And that's where historical information helps us. Everyone uses this without realizing it. So we all have patterns we take for commuting to work or to our local pub or restaurant or whatever. And there's a way we like to go, and we notice certain signs and we decide to go a different route because it seems as if the route we normally go is too crowded, or there's an accident or something like that. That kind of adjustment which of course our GPS doesn't do, is what we have to do. And we only learn that through being historically conscious of what we're doing. On our day-to-day basis, we tend to do that. When we make big decisions, we tend not to. And that's my point, that when we're thinking about this in terms of policy, when we're thinking about this in terms of big financial decisions, let's bring together those same questions and that same way of thinking about complexity to help improve our decision making.
I think that's absolutely right. And, one of the things that I'd say I'm neither agreeable or disagreeable with the notion of AI, because I think that detracts from what is happening. However, I feel like I side quite heavily on people's opinions like Elon Musk, who call for essentially policy around AI creation and these sorts of things. My question specifically to you as a historian is, given how slow policy seems to move and how insurmountably fast technology is moving, how do we breach that gap?
I think that's one of the most important questions of our time. If you asked me to list, the 2 or 3 most important questions that we have to figure out, that's one of them. Because there's no doubt, and I know you've talked about this on other episodes of yours, the pace of change has increased. There's no doubt about that, not just in AI and everything. Climate change is faster, right, than it's been before. All sorts of things are happening on a faster pace. And our institutions are inevitably very slow. They're slow because they're always made for yesterday's problem, right? It's like every classroom is out of date the day it's been completed because the students are learning in a new way. So there's that problem. And then we're living in a time in all of our societies where we're going through this transition and people are trying to hold on to their institutions, even though their institutions need to change. So England, the United States, all of the so-called advanced world has institutions that are moving even slower than usual. So this is a real problem. I think this is precisely where we need the kind of historical thinking that I'm talking about. We need to find those specific areas, not everywhere, where making the maximum investment today can have the maximum effect to prepare us for the fast change around us. So we're not going to change and reform every institution. Let's think about the places where we can make the most difference. I'll give you a few examples, and they're all historical. They're ways of thinking about things historically, right? We know when new people enter society, a new generation, that one of their biggest challenges is finding a way to communicate and communicate in a way that brings people together, not takes them apart. The historian says that hate is very easy to infect in new technologies. So we should be investing, if we're historically informed, in trying to create, I don't know if they're rules, institutions, practices that encourage and incentivize unifying discussion, like what you're doing with your podcast, versus the kinds of hate mongering that we're seeing in different areas. And governments could reinforce that. That wouldn't require throwing away all of our laws and all of our institutions, but it would require investing, and perhaps investing also in the way we think about how large we allow companies like Facebook and others to become and how they should be regulated. That would be a historically informed question. It wouldn't address every problem we have with faster change, but it would allow us to catch up in one particular area. The other thing I would say is that what we know from other periods and other patterns and moments of this kind of rapid change and slow institutions is that the people who remake the institutions are usually not the policymakers, the people in Parliament or Congress. They're the people in those institutions. And so we should be empowering and preparing people to do that. And what makes our moment difficult is there are a lot of people who have a lot of technical knowledge who don't really understand the institutions they're working in, and people who understand the institutions who don't understand the technology. That's something we could also invest in. That's where our educational system could do a lot better. So those are the kinds of questions I think we need to ask. We're not going to fix this problem, but we can make targeted investments in particular kinds of reforms that'll have a big effect in allowing our institutions to catch up and allowing our society to better use institutions for the values we care about.
Because there's about 5 questions there, and I've already forgotten the first one, but the question that stands out the most that I have coming out of that prose is one of the big things that I see that's a problem is twofold. The first is we have determined, properly speaking, as you say, from a historical perspective, we've been able to mandate, create, and update rules, laws, all these sorts of things that govern the way that our society works, right? But really, at the base level, they're not all that dissimilar to the rules at which a computer is running by. They're created by the same people. They're created with generally the same intentions, and that is for the betterment of position X or solution Y. However, my first fear, and I'll ask two questions. My first fear is what happens when we understand the complex ability that we go through and the complex process that we go through in order to discern and make a decision. And what happens when we teach computers to do that, right? And the reason why that's a fear for me is because we've all seen Deep Blue and its sons and daughters are able to learn a game of chess quicker than I can prepare and eat a meal, right? Now, that's astounding. If you can go to something that has so many computations like a game of chess, and if you're able to design that and perform that with a simple set of rules, a simple set of algorithms, a simple set of structures, is it merely just a matter of time before we're able to teach computers the complexity of decision making? That's my first question.
I think there will be some elements we can teach them and some elements we can't. So let's go back to the chess example here. And here I'm repeating what many who have studied this in more depth than I have said. You can teach the computer to win at chess because there's a very clear outcome, right? There's a very clear outcome. We know what winning is. The most interesting questions are questions where we don't know what winning is. Mm-hmm. I mean, when we say we want to build a better society, you and I probably agree on 80% of that, but there's 20% of it that we don't really know what we're talking about. When we say as parents, we want our children to be happy, what does that mean? And so those are the kinds of judgments that reflect human complexity in one form or another. And those are the places where I do think you need the aesthetic judgment, the historical judgment, the contingent judgment, where it's not rule-based. That comes from human interaction in society. So there are other things that, yes, can be outsourced in a sense to artificial intelligence, but not that element. And I fear that if we try to give that to artificial intelligence, we will create an artificial end state that doesn't reflect what we really mean. If we make a program for a happy life, that really doesn't produce a happy life, because by virtue of it being programmed, it's not happy, right?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like we'll end up in some form of Kantian dystopia, where universal maxims will essentially rain down upon us, and we won't have an umbrella.
Yes.
My second point, or my second question, is about a topic that you touched on, which is the sort of disparity in relationships between institutions and engineers, right? Institutions, policymakers, engineers, and if we put a triptych in there of the actual tech as its own embodiment, right? And like, I work in IT, right? I work with computers. I don't work with AI closely, but I work with many data centers that host AI, so I understand roughly how it works. Now, excuse me, the thing that worries me the most is because there are no governing rules on even just what you are supposed to create with the technology, with the resources at your hand, because the software and because the ability to create is open source, meaning anyone in the world can use it, anyone in the world can develop something, create something. What we have is a free-for-all that's generally capitalist in its nature, right? People want to create stuff to make money, generally.
Right.
And that's fine, but when you have something like a Facebook or a Twitter or an Amazon or a Google or something similar, and as you touched on, these companies care predominantly about their bottom line, less so about building a better society, whatever that is, as we've already said, or whether that be the happiness of our children. Right? Indeed, what they care about is a bottom line, and Mark Zuckerberg, for instance, going home with a better check than he went home with last year.
Yes.
So when we're determining our lives And more, I find it become more and more apparent that humans are reliant on tech, and we are essentially, in my opinion, uploading our consciousness to tech. These people have a greater access to what it is to be human and are profiting off that. I feel that there is a vast problem with having very little to no idea of how that works, why that works, or what we should be doing to make it work, right?
I agree 100%. And again, I'll make another historical reference to sort of illustrate what I mean by historical thinking. This is an old problem, right? The most valuable commodity we all have is ourselves. It's not our money. It's not what's in the bank. It's who we are, right? We forget that, don't we? And throughout time, the urge of those with wealth has been to control other people's bodies in one form or another. Slavery, which is the original sin of American society, as well as others, is the most extreme form of this. Warfare, right? Warfare in various forms is a form of this. Servitude of other kinds. We can go through a whole long litany. Most societies have this in one way or another. We're a society today, or most of our societies, where people appear to be freer because we have more short-term choice in what we decide to do, where we go to school, what profession we want to go into. But precisely because of what you said, we have less control over the things that affect our bodies. The information that's coming into us, the images that are being put in front of us, the stimuli all around us. And of course, there have been a lot of studies of children, and they're being given messages if they're watching TV or they're on the web to purchase things they need, they don't need, right? And that's not a conspiracy. I think this is an old story, actually. And every society at a certain time has had to come up with ways of informing people of what is happening to their bodies and providing them, if they want to be a free society, with protections for their body. So that's why we have anti-slavery laws now, right? That's why we have laws that say you can't put children in a factory, at the age of 10 to work in a factory. And I think we're moving into the same kind of place in the way we think about information and data about our lives. You're absolutely right. I mean, right now, while we're recording, someone is getting this data on Zoom, and this is going somewhere, and there will be facial recognition software for you and I that will be far better, voice recognition, and that will be used for someone else's purposes, not our own. We need better protection over that. We need better information about where that's going, and there has to be better regulation of how our data is used by others. I completely agree with that. Our institutions have not even begun to ask the right questions. Where I think this will start to change, and you probably know more about this than I do, is where activists of different kinds with the technical knowledge, asking the right question, start to move in this direction. They might even make money, right? Selling software and informing people about this. And then you'll see institutions grow around that, quasi-governmental, quasi-private, to help protect our data. But I worry quite a lot about this. And I think it's an area where, as you said, certain individuals are gaining an inordinate amount of influence over our lives without our even knowing it. And they're not necessarily people who have government titles. That's what's really scary about it too.
Yeah, and I have quite a pessimistic view on this, actually. And my pessimistic view is that I believe it's too late in a lot of ways.
Wow.
You mentioned that we have short-term freedom of choice. I'm really not sure I agree, because short-term freedom of choice, by its nature, implicitly has an underwriting which says autonomy for choice. We don't have that autonomy. Most societies, if you are connected to the internet in any fashion, you will have been targeted some form of advert, right? Your Google searches are different. If I searched Jeremi Suri, I would get different links than you would get.
Right.
So even at the source, what we determine to be the source of truth, aka a Google search, right? Which in itself is insane, right? If you think about that, the source of truth is no longer a conversation with your father or your mother or the elder of your society. No, it's a conversation with a machine that gives you different answers to the person next to you.
Yes.
So
yes.
The very notion of truth is gray now. And if we are unable, and I feel like we are unable in most high GDP country societies to have autonomy of free thought, because in some fashion we will have been infected with the malware of adverts, right? I'm not sure there is such a thing as short-term freedom of choice anymore. You mentioned about, sorry, go on.
No. I think you raised so many important points. I just wanted to react to your excellent points there. I think you touched on the question of the truth, which of course is something we're all confronted with more and more today. What you spoke about so well, how different ideas infect even the questions we ask, and how we go to a particular source that we all know is not designed for truth telling, to look for truth, right? It's a verb now, to Google, right? When I was in college, it wasn't a verb, right? But also, as you say, how the truth has become a gray area. So here's a really interesting thing. I think we all have to re-educate ourselves on what the truth is. And where I'm a little more optimistic than you is that I think this moment should remind us that we have to do that. Now, we might fail to do that as a species, and there might be an evolutionary consequence to that. That's, I guess, the dystopia. But the possible improved situation, improved pathway would be to see that we've taken the truth for granted for too long. Again, most societies have been in environments of contested truth. Rumor, lies, those were what religious institutions, political institutions, business institutions have used since time immemorial. And we did for maybe 50 years in the mid-20th century for a variety of reasons in one corner of the world, in a wet Northern Europe and the United States, right? We had some consensus on the truth, and we had some standards that allowed us to get reasonably close to it, whatever that is. But now, because of technology, we have to recognize that even though we pretend that's there, it's not there. And the politics of our societies make this so clear. I see that as an opportunity, though, Harry, because I see it as a moment to educate even the most unintellectual citizen to recognize that they shouldn't just believe what comes up on their Google search engine, and that they have to ask other questions about it, and they have to go and talk to people. The way I see the popularity of podcasts like yours with my students is not that they're more intellectual, because they're not reading more books, but that they recognize they can't just believe what comes up on their Google search engine. So they want to talk, they want to hear about it, and they want to, again, make the kinds of judgments we make as human beings as to who is believable and who is not believable. I see that as an opportunity, but I think it's an opportunity we need to take on and think seriously about. Otherwise, we go down the path that you described so well.
Yeah, I think you raise a fantastic point about podcasts, and actually one of the quasi selfish reasons of me starting this whole thing was because I feel like for generations that are just below myself, reading is dead. To the vast majority of people, reading is dead. It's too arduous, it takes too much effort, and the attention span of the generation below me doesn't exist. It just doesn't exist anymore. However, if I asked my nephew, who's 4 years old, right? If I said to him, sit down for half an hour and read this book, he'd struggle. But if I asked him to watch this video that we're recording right now for 30 minutes, he'd be far more inclined to do it. The medium at which our brains have evolved to consume information, consume data has changed, right? I'll give a small story about said nephew. And this sort of alludes to the point that you've said about the opportunity that we have at this moment right now. So when my nephew was 3 years old, right, wasn't able to write his name properly yet, right? But what he did instead is managed to unlock my sister's phone, go to her app store, purchase the Spider-Man movie that he wanted to watch, download it to the phone, stream it to the TV, right? All with never being shown how to do this.
Wow.
Right?
Wow.
Merely just watching and observing and taking that information in. And my point to your opportunity is, I don't know whether this is, this is entirely farcical and probably a very stupid statement, but I'll say it anyway and we'll go with it. I feel like technology is now bred into the DNA of the children of our future, right? The notion of how to use technology is bred into the very DNA, the very core of the future of our children. And I feel like, as you've rightly said, if we don't take this opportunity as the elders of society to show that there is another way, then I feel humanity as we know it is gone, right? Because if you can have a 3-year-old that, to us, like me writing my name was one of the first things that I learned after walking and, you know, stringing sentences together, right? If that's now morphed into the consumption of technology and the consumption of data through a TV, then something is very, very different in the way that our brains are working.
Yeah, I think that's true. And I think there's another element to that implied in what you said so well, which is the iPhone, or whatever version of it one uses, is made to be so intuitive and so user-friendly. So we have adjusted, but so is the technology. One of the big accomplishments of the last decade and a half was just that. I think this is really the Steve Jobs contribution, right? That the device we use, whether it's a laptop, a smartphone, whatever, it shouldn't require us to develop some kind of technical specialization as we had to when we used prior computers, like we had an IBM and an MS-DOS operating system, that it has to be natural, it has to be intuitive. And so these things have become extensions of us. We have retrained ourselves, but they have been retrained for us. And that's the opportunity, right? It's not simply our being didactic and saying, you know, learn to think and be critical, right? It's actually working to make the technology encourage that in us, not to dumb us down, right? Steve Jobs proved you could actually increase performance by making the technology more intuitive. Let's now increase truth pursuit. Let's increase critical thinking in the way we set up technologies. And it's interesting you brought up books. As someone who writes books, one of the things publishers are struggling with right now is how to make text more readable, more accessible to someone reading it, not just on a Kindle, that's going to be outdated very soon, but in exactly the technological settings you described for your nephew. We should be able to get our ideas and texts in front of him. Maybe they'll look different. Maybe there'll be more pictures. Maybe it'll move in different ways. But I believe that human beings in every culture, in every time, have always wanted to read and tell stories. And we need to find a new way to do that. And if we think about it that way, I actually think we can get people to take in more information. I find this with my students, Harry. I still assign books, but I assign, you know, interesting podcasts. I don't just suggest them, I assign them. That it's part of the learning process. If it's related to the topic we're teaching. I assign videos, I assign documentaries, I assign a whole range of things you and I didn't have when we were in school. And I think they're actually taking more information in as a consequence. And I think this can be true for your nephew as well.
So I have it's quite a broad question, but I'll attempt it. And before I attempt it, I just want to give a small compliment, but I guess a double-sided one. And that's that I'm not sure, or maybe you can educate me, but I'm not sure how many people there are like yourself that are willing to rapidly move with the times. You're a man that writes books, but you're also a professor that assigns documentaries and podcasts and YouTube videos and this and the next thing. My fear is that, and pardon me for saying this, Mark Zuckerberg has slightly more influence than yourself right now, as we speak of today, right? And maybe that'll change, who knows?
After your podcast episode.
Thank you. But yeah, I mean, my fear is that the men and women that run the companies that govern our society, and I use that word importantly, they care little about the things that we are discussing: truth-telling, truth-seeking, critical thinking. What they care about is addiction, right? So the question that I have, and the broad question I have, is, do you feel like, from your research, that there has ever been a time where there has been such potential for cataclysmic change in what it means to be human? And what I don't mean by that is nuclear war, because I mean, then fine, that is what it is. But I feel like we are on the brink of reducing to dust what it means to be human.
Well, it's a great question. I don't think there's ever been a time when it could happen so rapidly. And I think that's what makes it really scary.
Yeah.
It comes back to your really, I think, crucial observation about the pace of change. Because there have been all sorts of religious movements, medical developments. Think of the plagues of the 14th and 15th century.
Sure.
Entire cities were wiped out. We've lived through a pandemic now, but it's nothing. We're very fortunate. It's nothing on the scale. And then we're able to develop vaccines. I mean, this is incredible what we're able to do now. So I think there have been moments in history when a variety of climactic, medical, technological, ideological, religious, political factors do lead to a fundamental threat to what it means to be human. And again, think of what slavery meant to all those who were enslaved in the United States and other societies for so long. So the dehumanization of populations is something that we've experienced before. But it's usually really hard work. And it usually takes a long time, and it usually is stopped because it's hard and takes so long.
Sure.
And I think your point today, the scary part of this is not even so much the threat, it's the rapidity that it can happen. And it can happen so fast in an irreversible way. And we haven't had time even to react to it. And I think that's what we need to be on guard against. And I think that's why we need to be paying attention to these issues now, as you say, not waiting for another day.
May I offer my I've thought about this for a long time, and every time I try to explain this, it gets more intricate. But I wanted to explain it to yourself and see how you feel about it. This to me is, I'm not going to call it dystopia, because again, I don't feel emotionally towards the scenario regardless, but an end state that I could see us in, right? And I'll start by saying, when you were mentioning that what way can we get children in front of your texts, right? Well, how about if instead of holding a physical book, they placed the headset on and they were transported to a room, virtual or not, where you were sat, maybe in the chair that you're sat in right now, and in front of them, whether it's tangible, well, I mean, it's not because it's virtual, but it would feel tangible, right? They sat along and you read your book, and they could ask questions to the virtual you, and they could annotate, and they could, look at a word. If let's say there was a word they didn't understand or they wanted more clarification on, they could look at that word, and over in the right-hand side of a corner, that word would be shown again to them, synonyms, related searches, everything you can imagine.
Right.
And that's one thing. Something that became entirely apparent to me over this lockdown was the vast amount of unnecessary office working, and how entirely plausible it is that a high percentage, 90, maybe 85% of all jobs could be done remotely, right? Now, if we extract that, I'll ask you a question. What do you need to leave your house for today?
That's a great question. Not too many things.
Right. If you wanted social interaction, and I'm not talking the peak of social interaction, but the base minimum of social interaction, you could call your family. You could call your friends. You could have a conversation over FaceTime, over a Zoom meeting. You could have whatever social interaction you wanted, right? If you wanted to order some new clothes, you could do that. If you wanted to buy food, you could do that. Medicine, do that. Water, do that. There's not much else at a very base minimum level that we need to survive, right? So we talked about the companies that were making people addicted to their product, right? If that addiction moves much further, and the adverts move much further, and the control of our bodies moves much further, and we implore and we dive and we drill deeper into this hole of data as currency, right? And the overlords of our banks, our currency banks, Mr. Zuckerberg, hey, how's it going? If they continue to produce at the level that they are producing, there'd be no reason to leave your house ever, right? If everything was communicated through a VR headset, let's just say, and if in this VR headset, for instance, as a man of history, if I said to you, you could go anywhere in recorded history and see it firsthand, feel it, smell it, touch it.
I love it. I love it.
Right? You love it. But if I also said to you, you could live however long you wanted in that situation, I'd never see you again. And if that's enticing to you as an intellectual, if I could put a VR headset on you and say, Jeremy, think of something, and it exists, and you can imagine it, you can go and you can envelop yourself in it, the world ceases to exist as we know it. And given, sorry, my final point, given the amount of data that we are transferring and the rate of data that we are transferring, the bandwidth that we are transferring to technology, to servers, to hard drives, to AI algorithms, I think, as you have rightly said, if we don't grasp this opportunity, a similar world is upon us very quickly.
So I think what you're sketching is plausible. It involves, obviously some major technological leaps,
Yeah, absolutely.
but it's very plausible. But I also think the pandemic, the lockdown, taught us that there were things we needed outside the house. The things that I thought I needed outside my house, I don't need as much. Sure. I don't need, you're right, I don't need to go to the grocery store. They can deliver the food to me here, right? I love going to bookshops, but I don't really have to do that, right? I can order books. I can read more books electronically. There are all sorts of things. And you're right. In fact, there are a lot of people I spend time meeting with normally I would prefer to meet with this way, right?
Sure.
So you're absolutely right. But there are other things, that we missed. I really needed every day to get out of the house just to get some fresh air, just and maybe, a virtual headset could replace that. I'm not sure, though. I think there's something kinesthetic to being outside. There's something kinesthetic to being around people. I don't know if you had the same experience after we were vaccinated, my wife and I, and we started going back to restaurants and things, and I started going to some meetings, and still I'm doing a very small number outside of the house. But when I do them, it's almost like you have to relearn how to interact with people in person. There's a different relationship. And I think that's part of what makes us human. I think this is your point. And I think it's reminded us of how important that is to us. And so I think these are not and ors, these are combined elements, right? We need to be able to move in a direction where we take advantage of the technology, and maybe we don't have to go to grocery stores. Maybe we can distribute things more effectively, but then we emphasize more of the things that are valuable to ourselves, which is the kinesthetic connection, the ability, you and I can see each other right now while we're talking. We could have an even better conversation if we were in the same room in some respects, because just the signaling, the nonverbal signaling between us works even better. And there isn't that nanosecond that's lost. And so I think this comes back to the point that you're heading toward, which is that we have to start thinking deeply about these issues. And they're not technological issues, right? They're humanistic issues, and how we want to structure our society to enhance certain behaviors, or at least protect them. I think we all learned in the last year how important local parks are. You're fortunate you're in London, a city with lovely parks. You close them at night, which is always strange to an American, but during the day, lovely parks. This is a result, right, of the 19th century Green City movement in London, right? And maybe we need to invest more in those spaces and less in some of the other spaces that we were using before as public spaces. I think these are the conversations we need to have. And if we have these conversations as human beings in a society, even though the Zuckerbergs and others will be pushing us to use more technology, we can counteract that. We can do both at the same time. But it requires people to have their voices heard and to say this is important. And as you say, it requires powerful people to do that. And maybe that's the obligation we all have. We're not rich like Mark Zuckerberg, but we have education. We have a voice. We can communicate to people. And so we should be talking about this more.
Yeah, and I mean, obviously, this is my bias, and essentially, I've been looking for somebody to come up with a counter argument that's going to dissuade me from my thinking, and I feel like you're going to be that man. But I mean, we've talked about the risk slightly, but I feel like the tipping point to me, especially working and seeing, basically my job is automation, right? My job is to make things come away from people and make computers do them, right? Essentially,
to put them out of work. You put people out of work.
I mean, I guess so. I mean, at the moment, my job is to put myself out of work. So these things happen. But the more and more that I see, and as you say, it's very easy if I say, I know what the end outcome of this task wants to be, I can very easily program that to be whatever it is. However, there are things now where it's not, there has to be decisions. There's not an end state. There is a decision to make before a myriad of potential end states. And that's becoming easier to program. And that's becoming easier to get to. And I feel, and very like deep in my soul, I feel like the tipping point between, as you say, being able to bridge the gap of this dystopia and having these intelligent conversations and asking these important questions is increasingly going one or the other way. And I never went to university. I only did in the UK. I did the equivalent of college, I guess, which is A levels, and then
sure.
And I decided not to go to university. But I feel like maybe, and this is, I guess, one of the reasons why you can educate me too. Like, I wonder, what do you see from the children and the young people that you educate? Do you feel like they are relying more, and which way do you think they're swaying?
It's a great question. I think it's a little bit of both. I think for certain tasks and things, they are looking to technology to make the decisions for them, to take that burden off of them. I think, for example, in the United States, the entire college admissions process is it's a very convoluted, complicated, competitive process. Your process in England, I think, is more rational. It's more modest. And, people are constantly looking for someone to tell them what is the right school for them. They want a ranking. They want, what is the best place to study this one thing? And of course, there's no best place. It's like there's no best place to work. It depends on who you are and what the fit is between you and that office at that moment and that boss at that moment. But they're looking to standardize and have some artificial intelligence entity tell them what is the best place to go to school, and then factor that down. Their parents want to know what's the best place to send my kid, so my kid has the best chance to earn the most money, to marry the right person, to do so. There's no doubt that there's a push in that direction. And I think it takes the humanity out of the whole process. I think this is your precise point. So it's a mini version of the dystopia you're perceiving. On the other hand, I think there is a recognition more and more among my students, I've seen it change just in 10 years, that there are qualities of life, things they care about, values that cannot be substituted for by money or status or position. Don't get me wrong, my students all want to be rich and they all want to live in cool places, but they're recognizing that there are other things that are important as well. They don't want to work for banks as much as they used to. They want to work for companies that they think are doing good things for the world. They want to see their values there. And they don't look to a computer or artificial intelligence for that. That comes from within. That's sort of, I think, the urge to religion. I don't mean religion in terms of organized evangelical movements and things of that sort. I mean more this kind of private religion, or the individual spirituality, or the search for meaning, the existential element of this. And I think that's definitely there. I think that's definitely there. What motivates it for many of them, I'm sure this is true in England as well, is the sense that, things are not necessarily going to get better. You can't just assume that if you follow the pattern that you're told to follow, that you're going to live a better life. So you might as well make some choices for yourself. You might as well take some risks. And I think that's what I try to encourage as an educator. I often say to my students, don't listen to your parents. Of course, I have teenagers. I want them to listen to me, but for the other ones, don't listen to your parents, because the authoritative urge is to what exactly it is you're saying. I think the aesthetic values urge is to push away from that a little bit. And I think this conversation helps them to see that. And I think there are ways in which my students, are trying to command technology for their purposes more than they did in the past. They're not completely succeeding. Most of my students now don't go to the normal mainstream sources of information. They distrust them. And that's probably a good urge.
Sure. Yeah, sure. I I guess my only rebuttal to that, and I mean, it's vastly promising, by the way. I don't like the word hope, but it's vastly promising that you are finding a positive result, frankly. I mean,
Yes.
it fits with my narrative to say that there are, it's going to be impossible for Zuckerberg to release one algorithm and then everyone just falls in line entirely. However, I feel like, ebbing and chipping away at those things, what you're doing essentially is it's a propaganda machine to say, oh, look, we could do this for you, 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 and it's only a matter of time, unless we take the opportunity that we've already said, that's going to slide further and further down.
Yes.
In the same vein, as we've spoken about freedoms and whatever, my only fear, and I'd be interested to talk to you in 10 years to see if the children that are growing up now are going to do the same thing, is that we spoke earlier about tech being in a child's DNA, right? Well, the scope of that tech will only have increased from the children you're teaching now to my nephew, for instance.
Right.
So when my nephew goes up, and whether he goes to university or not, it's going to be very interesting to see what those people do and how those people behave in these specific scenarios. Because you talk about inner religion, and I think that was a fantastic, beautiful point. But if we're saying that tech is embedded in the DNA, well, what advertisements are being made to the DNA that will then determine that inner religion? And how do we, as a populace, counteract that? How do we perform intellectual surgery on that part of the populace?
Yes, I think now you are hitting on another area where, back to your original question, also we can find certain institutions to reform in small ways that can have big effects. We need to rethink, because of everything you just said, that I agree with 100%, we need to rethink early education. Because in a certain way, early education has to push back against everything you're saying. In the 19th century, the Anglo-American world created the high school, as we call it in the US, which didn't exist before, the public high school. And it's now assumed in all of our societies that you go to a public high school. That was pushing against the big industrial robber barons. Instead of 12-year-olds going into a factory or going to work on the railroad, they were required by law to go to a school that was free, where they were taught skills so they could actually defend themselves in a way they couldn't before. So they could speak for themselves. They could be literate, right? That was the point, was pushing against the illiteracy of an exploited workforce. We, just building on everything you said, we need now to create early education environments for everyone that push against the excessive programming through technology. That doesn't mean there are going to be spaces without technology, but where we are early on with people who are trained beyond my training to understand how the brain works, making sure that your nephew's brains and others are exposed not just to what happens to come up on Google and on the apps or App Store, but other things and other ways of thinking and other ways of seeing the world. Maybe even being forced to sit and read a book. So it becomes part of another way of acquiring information. I mean, what allows you and I to be critical thinkers is it's not just that we go to multiple websites, we use multiple kinds of technology. We get our material in multiple ways. And so I would say that the historical lesson here is that's where we need to put the emphasis. It's not just the money, it's how we think about that early education, not just how to be better at using technology, how to think beyond what the technology is programming us to do. In the Scandinavian countries, they have a whole movement to have kids in school doing things with their hands more, building.
Yes.
And I think it's part of this. Maybe they have an insight there. That's another way of thinking about relating, where, as you say, you're getting outside. You're being forced to actually get up off your behind and do things, right? So maybe that's where we need to start thinking. That's where we need to maybe push back and re-engineer ourselves a little bit.
I'm going to ask a slightly tyrannical, maybe even voluptuous question. And that's, when you were growing up, your father would say things to you and you'd be like, oh, this man just needs to get with the times, right? This man needs to be more modern. This man needs to follow what's happening truly with the world. This man doesn't understand. He's old now, etc., etc.
My kids now say this to me. I have a 16-year-old and an 18-year-old, and it's a very
Awesome.
humbling experience to now be on the other side, to be that guy.
Yes, yes. And my question is, are we just grandstanding here?
Yeah.
Are we just saying, well, actually, our way is far better. Our determination of humanity is far better because we can do X, Y, and Z. Do you think it's not pertinent to just allow the waves to continue in their way?
Yeah, I think about this all the time.
Mm.
And absolutely, you referred to this already. There are so many brilliant colleagues I have who are opposed to all kinds of change because they think they figured it all out. And they can just put in words what many people feel, which is you become comfortable. You can even be miserable, but you're comfortable in your misery, right?
Yes, absolutely.
And so there's an urge against change. And as one gets older, we're more set in our ways. There's no doubt about it. I'm a person of routines. The secret to being productive in life is, I think, being routinized, right? So that means I'm in my routines and I'm very comfortable with them. And so, yes, there is some of that. But the alternative is not right either, to just jump at the new thing.
Mm.
My view is always, I want to be an early adopter, but not the first adopter. Right. I like electric cars. I have an electric car, but I wasn't the first one to buy one. I'm not gonna be the last. Now they're good. Right? Yeah. I was very happy to get vaccinated early, but I didn't really want to be the first one. I was happy to be, number 2000 or whatever. And so I think there's a happy space in between. And I think actually that's what historical thinking is. This is a great way to come back to what I talked about in the TED Talk, right? The antiquarian is the one who wants to live in the past, right? The one who says, let's all just, let's go back and be David Lloyd George or Abraham Lincoln. They figured it all out, right? These guys, right? These wise old men of marble. And the futurist, right, is the one who just wants to jump on. I'm going to Mars tomorrow. Historical thinking is understanding the past, taking some of the past into the present as you embrace the new. That's historical thinking, right? Because history is about change over time. So what is it from our past that is still valuable today? We have to ask that question, not assume it. And how can we adjust it to the future? So I think you and I agree that at the essence of humanity is the belief in the connection between human beings and the desire. It's a desire we'll never fully succeed at, to increase love and happiness, right? It's abstract, but it's real also, right? We all search for love. We all want to be happy. We want others to be happy. We have a natural empathy for others. And the engineering of our systems doesn't have that. We can try to put it in there. It doesn't have that. So history teaches us certain things we can do that are still useful today to awaken that. But there's some things from the past that don't work today. Arranged marriages, child marriages, all these things requiring only, heterosexual relationships. Those don't work in our world today. So you have to adjust to that. And that's the discussion. There's no formula for that. That's the kind of judgment we're making. And that's the space our discussions have to be in. And the issue of sexual preference, I think, is a really good one to talk about in this situation. I'm a parent. I don't want my children just going out and trying everything, every new drug, every new form of relationship. But I also recognize they can learn maybe from the relationships they see that I have with my wife and others, but theirs are going to be different. And I'm embracing that. Yeah. But I want to see that they're at least in discussion with what they've learned from the past as they're thinking about the future. That's the space we have to be in.
Yeah, and I think what you've just mentioned relates all the way back to the truth point. Right, is there must be an innate religion, an innate truth, an innate set of morals and values that aren't corrupted. That is what's so difficult, right? And even to we're talking like we're on high with our absolute morals. We are just as corrupted, but in varying fashions. And I feel like, as you say, life is innately complex, as we touched on at the very start of this, but I feel like the density of that complexity is just widening and deepening and widening and deepening, and this is one of the things that, because whilst I understand and I look over the cliff and I peer down at the complexity sea, I also understand that as I look out, I'm only looking at a gram of salt to what is, and my ability to purvey that is very minimal. However, if I feel overwhelmed, I wonder what is going to happen to everyone else that isn't thinking about this.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think it's a real privilege to have the ability that you and I and many of your listeners have to take the time even to be able to think about this. Think of the number of people who are working multiple jobs.
Yeah.
And they come home and they're so exhausted. They can't resist these pressures around them, right?
Yep.
And so I think it's important to find space and to give people space for this, and to encourage this and make this accessible for them. The other thing I was thinking when you spoke that I think is so important is that we are humbled. We have to be humbled. That what we're certainly not advocating here is some sort of magic bullet solution because of trends we don't like. Here's this. I think you're the same way. I am skeptical of any easy solutions.
Yes.
And
I think that's fantastic because, you know, in listening to however many episodes I listen to of your podcast, you know, they're generally an hour long and you're covering one topic, and I come away with an essay worth of questions.
Yes.
Right? And I'm like, oh, okay. You know, there are bountiful complex problems for us to try and determine, and none of them have simple solutions. Right? And to your point, that's actually the people that I worry most about, the people that are working 3 jobs, 2 jobs, and instead their downtime generally is spent hugged by a data throttle, right?
Right.
And the data throttle around their neck is sucking what is their consciousness from them in the mere beauty moments, the purest moments of rest and relaxation that they have. And those are the people that I worry about the most. You know, as you say, you and I are entirely fortunate that I can go to bed at night thinking about this conversation rather than thinking about where am I going to put food on my children's plate tomorrow. And to your point, I feel like these are the people. You talked about the initiation of public high schools for free, and you spoke earlier about, and I think, you know, I'm just attempting to sum this up slightly, is that there has to be a metric, there has to be a method, there has to be availability for people to educate themselves in a way that is efficient and a way that is accessible, right? Because as you say, to be a Luddite is ludicrous. To be an Elon Musk, there's only one man that can do that, and it's not me, right? But to your point, you actually touched on something deeply philosophical, and something that I got from your podcast is that I subscribe to quite a bit of Jungian theory, and one of the most important theories he has is the idea of balance, the idea of you know, walking the tightrope between chaos and order, and understanding the depths of both. And essentially what you've just noted on is something that's very important to me specifically, and that's that, you know, I mean, look at the title of the podcast.
I was going to say that was the first thing that attracted me to your podcast. I thought, wow, what a great title. A great title because it's a wonderful literary title, but also because it captures this precise point, right? Yeah. It's not either or, there's no one solution. You're constantly balancing and rebalancing. Yeah. So we might get it right. Maybe we'll do better in the next few years. But then but that doesn't mean we're out of the woods. Then we have to keep rebalancing all the time. It's a push and pull. It's a yin and yang.
It is.
You know, the people often they sort of make the American founders these demigods. They weren't demigods, but this was the one insight they had, that a system that survives is a system that's constantly rebalancing itself.
Yes.
And I think that's to where you started with your questions before. I think that's where we feel our society is a little out of balance now. I'm taking from what you said that we have gone a little bit in the direction of technology driving us. Mm-hmm. And I think what we're struggling, and I don't have obviously exactly what to do about it, but I think where the discussions have to go are toward how can we readjust that balance, and what does it look like, and who's going to do that readjustment. And I'm fully convinced that some of that readjustment has to come from young people younger than you and I right now, your nephew. We need to somehow give them the space and the motivation to figure it out for themselves, not to do it the way we want it to be done, but to figure it out for themselves.
I completely agree. And I think actually that's a beautiful place to leave it. I understand that we're short on time, so I don't want to breach into your day too much. From the bottom of my heart, I want to thank you for this hour that you've given to me. It's been one of the most fascinating and the most enriching conversations I've had on this podcast, and for that I am truly grateful. Thank you very much.
Well, I want to tell you how much I've enjoyed every moment of this, and I am so honored to be a part of this. To me, the conversations that are most meaningful are when I get to talk to someone new who opens my mind in a new way, and you've done that. And I really mean that. And I hope to be on your podcast again. And I hope to listen to many, many episodes.
Oh, that would be an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much.
My pleasure. My pleasure.